The courtroom was quiet, so quiet that the sound of the old clock ticking on the wall felt like it was echoing. J.D. Vance stood in the middle of the room, his tall frame stiff and his face calm, but anyone who looked closely could see the tension in his jaw and the faint tremble in his hands. He had been through tough situations before, arguments, debates, even hostile interviews, but this was different. This wasn't just another fight for him, it was personal. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, and the rows of seats behind him were filled with people watching, waiting, judging. At the front of the room sat the judge, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and piercing eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His expression was stern, almost cold, as he leaned forward slightly in his chair. The gavel lay untouched on the desk in front of him, but its presence loomed over everyone in the room. The judge's voice broke the silence, sharp and clear, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "Mr. Vance," he said, his tone firm and unyielding, "you need to understand the seriousness of this situation. If you continue down this path, I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt of court." J.D. flinched ever so slightly at the words, though he tried hard not to show it. His lawyer, seated beside him, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The man whispered something under his breath, too low for anyone else to hear, but J.D. didn't respond. His mind was racing, replaying everything that had led him here. How had it come to this? Just a few months ago, he'd been riding high, confident in his decisions and sure of his place in the world. Now, standing in this courtroom, he felt the weight of every choice he'd ever made pressing down on him. The crowd behind him was a mix of faces, some curious, some angry, others simply there to watch the drama unfold. Reporters scribbled notes furiously in their notebooks while cameras clicked softly from the back of the room. J.D. knew they were all waiting for him to slip up, to say or do something that would confirm whatever narrative they wanted to write about him. He clenched his fists briefly before forcing himself to relax. He couldn't let them see him crack, not now, not here. The case itself was complicated, tangled up in politics, business deals, and accusations that J.D. had acted recklessly. Some called him a hero, a self-made man who had risen from humble beginnings to achieve success against all odds. Others saw him as reckless, someone who cared more about winning than doing what was right. And now here he was, standing in front of a judge who seemed determined to make an example out of him. For a moment, J.D.'s thoughts drifted back to his childhood. He remembered growing up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and struggles. His family hadn't been wealthy. In fact, they'd often struggled to make ends meet. But they had taught him the value of hard work and perseverance. Those lessons had stuck with him throughout his life, shaping the person he had become. But now, as he stood in this courtroom, he wondered if those same lessons had also blinded him to the consequences of his actions. The judge's voice brought him back to reality. "Do you understand what I'm saying, Mr. Vance?" the older man asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. J.D. nodded quickly, his throat dry. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. He wanted to explain, to defend himself, but he knew better than to speak out of turn. Instead, he focused on breathing, one slow inhale after another, trying to steady his racing heart. His lawyer leaned closer, whispering urgently into his ear. "Stay calm," the man murmured, his voice barely audible. "Don't give them anything to use against you." J.D. nodded again, though he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his composure. The pressure was overwhelming, like a wall closing in around him. He glanced briefly at the crowd behind him, searching for a familiar face, someone who might offer support or encouragement. But all he saw were strangers, their expressions unreadable. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew thicker. The judge shuffled through some papers on his desk, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Every sound, the rustle of paper, the creak of a chair, the soft murmur of voices seemed amplified in the silence. J.D.'s mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Would the judge really send him to jail? Was this the end of everything he had worked so hard to build? Or was there still a chance, however slim, to turn things around? Then, without warning, something unexpected happened. A woman sitting quietly in the back row suddenly stood up. She was slender, with dark hair tied neatly into a bun, and her face was pale but determined. For a moment she hesitated, as if unsure whether she should go through with whatever she was planning. But then she took a deep breath and stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. The room fell silent once more, all eyes turning toward her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling slightly but strong enough to carry across the room. "There's something important you need to know about Mr. Vance, and why we're really here today." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and for a brief moment time seemed to stop. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, and gestured for her to continue. Everyone else in the room leaned forward slightly, eager to hear what she had to say. J.D. turned to look at her, confusion written plainly on his face. He didn't recognize her at first, but as she began speaking, realization dawned on him. She was Sarah Miller, a former employee from one of his companies. He remembered her vaguely, a quiet woman who had always kept to herself, but he never imagined she would be the one to step forward in a moment like this. As she spoke, her voice gaining confidence with each word, J.D. felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, curiosity, and maybe even a flicker of hope. Sarah's story painted a picture of J.D. Vance that few in the room had seen before. She described moments when he had gone out of his way to help struggling employees, using his own resources to ensure they didn't lose their jobs or homes. She admitted he could be blunt, sometimes harsh, but argued that those traits masked a deeper sense of responsibility. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The tension eased slightly, replaced by a sense of intrigue and uncertainty. Even the judge seemed affected, his earlier sternness giving way to thoughtful consideration. By the time Sarah finished speaking, the room was buzzing with quiet murmurs. People exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others frowning in skepticism. J.D., for his part, felt a surge of gratitude toward Sarah, though he didn't know how to express it. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things weren't completely hopeless. The judge cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him, and announced that he needed a few moments to think. The wait felt endless, but J.D. knew it was only the beginning. Whatever happened next, he realized, would change everything, for better or for worse. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the surface of the desk. His eyes were fixed on Sarah Miller, who now stood awkwardly in the middle of the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The silence that followed her testimony was heavy, almost suffocating as everyone waited for the judge to respond. J.D. Vance, still standing near the center of the room, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He didn't dare look directly at Sarah, though he could feel her presence like a shadow hovering nearby. His mind raced, trying to piece together what she had said and how it might affect the outcome of this hearing. Sarah's words lingered in the air, painting a picture of J.D. that few people in the room had expected. She hadn't just defended him, she had humanized him. Her story wasn't polished or rehearsed, it felt raw, honest, and deeply personal. She talked about late nights when J.D. had stayed behind to help struggling employees figure out their finances. She mentioned times when he had quietly paid medical bills for workers too proud to ask for help, and she described how, despite his tough exterior, he often carried the weight of others' problems on his shoulders, even when it cost him personally. It was a side of J.D. Vance that most people had never seen, or perhaps refused to see. For a moment, J.D. allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe Sarah's words had planted a seed of doubt in the judge's mind, enough to make him reconsider the harsh punishment he had threatened earlier. But hope was dangerous, J.D. reminded himself. It could blind you, make you believe things would work out when they rarely did. Still, he couldn't ignore the fact that something had shifted in the room. The hostility that had filled the courtroom just minutes ago seemed to have softened, replaced by a curious mix of skepticism and intrigue. The judge finally spoke, breaking the tension that had settled over the room. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice calm but probing, "can you explain why you chose to share this information today? Why now?" Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping briefly to the floor before meeting the judge's eyes again. "Because it's the truth," she replied simply, her voice steady despite the nerves evident in her posture. "And because I think it's important for everyone to understand that Mr. Vance isn't the person some people are making him out to be." Her answer seemed to satisfy the judge, at least for the moment. He nodded slowly, then turned his attention back to J.D. "Mr. Vance," he began, his tone less severe than before. "Do you have anything to say in response to Ms. Miller's testimony?" J.D. took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his chance to speak, to take control of the narrative. But he knew one wrong word could undo everything Sarah had just accomplished. He stepped forward slightly, clearing his throat before he began. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and measured. "I want to thank Ms. Miller for sharing her perspective. What she said is true. I've always believed in taking care of the people around me, especially those who depend on me. But I also know that doesn't excuse every decision I've made." He paused, glancing briefly at Sarah before continuing. "I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes, and I'll be the first to admit that. But I've always tried to do what I thought was right, even when it wasn't easy." His words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. For the first time that day, J.D. allowed himself to show vulnerability. Gone was the confident, almost defiant demeanor he had walked into the courtroom with. In its place was a man who seemed genuinely reflective, someone willing to acknowledge his flaws without making excuses for them. The change was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. The judge studied him carefully, his expression unreadable while members of the audience exchanged glances, whispering softly among themselves. J.D. continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. "This case isn't just about me," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the crowd behind him. "It's about bigger issues, problems within industries like mine that force people into difficult situations. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I do believe we need to start having honest conversations about these challenges. Yes, I've made mistakes, but so has everyone else in this room. The question is, are we willing to learn from them?" By the time he finished speaking, the mood in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The tension that had gripped the room earlier had eased, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. Even the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks seemed momentarily distracted, their pens pausing mid-sentence as they absorbed J.D.'s words. Sarah, still standing near the back of the room, gave him a small nod of approval, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. The judge sat silently for several moments, his brow furrowed in thought. He tapped his pen against the desk, the sound rhythmic and deliberate as if marking time. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "What you've said here today gives me pause. I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge your shortcomings, and I commend Ms. Miller for stepping forward to offer her perspective. However, accountability is not optional. It's essential. If we're going to move forward, there must be consequences for actions taken, no matter how well-intentioned they may have been." J.D. nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the judge's words. "I understand, Your Honor," he replied, his voice tinged with both relief and resignation. "I'm prepared to face whatever comes next." The judge studied him for a moment longer, then glanced at Sarah, who still stood quietly in the back of the room. "Ms. Miller," he said, addressing her directly, "thank you for your courage in speaking up today. Your testimony has provided valuable insight into this matter." As the judge prepared to deliver his final decision, the room fell silent once more. J.D. felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him: hope, fear, gratitude, and uncertainty, all colliding in ways he couldn't fully process. He glanced briefly at Sarah again, silently thanking her for what she had done. Without her intervention, he doubted the hearing would have unfolded the way it had. Whatever happened next, he realized, she had given him a fighting chance. A chance to prove that he was more than the sum of his mistakes. The judge cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. "After careful consideration," he began, his voice carrying authority and finality, "I've decided against issuing jail time in this case. However, Mr. Vance, you will be required to adhere to strict conditions moving forward. These include regular check-ins with court-appointed officials, community service, and mandatory participation in programs aimed at addressing the systemic issues you yourself acknowledge today. J.D. exhaled sharply, the weight of relief washing over him. It wasn't a free pass, he knew that, but it was far better than the alternative. He nodded earnestly, his voice filled with sincerity as he responded, "Thank you, Your Honor, I won't let you down." The judge gave him a curt nod before banging his gavel, signaling the end of the hearing. As the sound echoed through the room, the crowd erupted into murmurs, some applauding softly while others shook their heads in disagreement. J.D. stepped out of the courtroom a short while later, the bright sunlight outside momentarily blinding him. Reporters swarmed him immediately, shoving microphones into his face and shouting questions about redemption, second chances, and what came next. He raised a hand to shield his eyes, pausing briefly to gather his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but resolute. "Sometimes," he said, looking directly at the cameras, "it takes hitting rock bottom to see who you truly are and who you can still become." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a crowd, divided yet undeniably captivated by the drama that had unfolded within those courtroom walls. As J.D. Vance stepped out of the courthouse, the world outside felt strangely different from the one he had left behind just hours earlier. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn leaves and distant car exhaust. Sunlight streamed down, glinting off the lenses of cameras and bouncing off the polished shoes of reporters who scrambled to get closer to him. For a moment, J.D. paused at the top of the courthouse steps, letting the noise wash over him. Shouts of his name, questions about his future plans, and even a few accusations mingled together in a chaotic symphony. He didn't respond immediately, instead taking a deep breath as if grounding himself before facing the storm. Behind him, Sarah Miller emerged quietly from the courthouse doors. Unlike J.D., she didn't draw much attention. Just a few curious glances from reporters who quickly returned their focus to the man standing front and center, but J.D. noticed her. Turning slightly, he caught her eye and gave her a small, grateful nod. She hesitated for a second, then offered a tentative smile before slipping away into the crowd. J.D. watched her go, feeling a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or maybe guilt. Either way, he knew he owed her more than words could ever express. Turning back to face the reporters, J.D. raised a hand to silence them. It took a few moments, but eventually the clamor died down enough for him to speak. "I'm not going to lie," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Today was harder than I expected. I came here thinking I knew what to expect. But life has a way of surprising you." He paused, scanning the sea of faces before him. Some were skeptical, others curious, and a few genuinely seemed to care. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about me, it was about choices, consequences, and the importance of owning up to our mistakes. His words struck a chord with some in the crowd, though others whispered among themselves, questioning whether this was all part of a calculated performance. J.D. didn't blame them for doubting him. He'd spent years building a reputation as someone who played by his own rules, often brushing aside criticism with sharp words and unshakable confidence. Today, however, he had shown a side of himself that many weren't used to seeing, a vulnerable, reflective version of J.D. Vance that felt almost foreign even to him. The reporters pressed on, firing questions faster than he could answer. "Do you think this will affect your career?" one shouted. "Are you planning to make changes in how you run your businesses?" another asked. J.D. held up a hand again, signaling for patience. "Look," he said, his tone firm but calm, "I'm not here to make promises or grand statements. What I will say is this. I've learned a lot today, not just about myself, but about the people around me and the impact my actions have on them. Moving forward, I intend to do better. That's all any of us can really ask for." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the reporters shouting after him. Cameras flashed, capturing his retreating figure as he descended the steps and disappeared into a waiting car. Inside the vehicle, J.D. leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment. The day's events replayed in his mind like a film reel, each scene vivid and charged with emotion. He thought about the judge's stern warning, Sarah's unexpected testimony, and the weight of accountability now resting squarely on his shoulders. It was overwhelming, but also oddly liberating. For the first time in a long while, JD felt like he had a clear path ahead, even if it was paved with challenges. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that allowed thoughts to wander freely. JD stared out the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of gray and gold. His phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, notifications piling up from friends, colleagues, and acquaintances reacting to the day's events. He ignored them for now, knowing he'd have to address them eventually but needing a moment to process everything first. When he arrived at his house, a modest yet tastefully decorated place tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, he stepped inside and sank onto the couch. The room was warm, filled with the comforting smells of coffee and old books. It was a space where he rarely let outsiders in, a sanctuary where he could be himself without judgment. Tonight, though, the solitude felt heavier than usual. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the messages, his thumb hovering over Sarah's name in his contacts list. Should he call her, thank her properly, apologize for whatever pain his decisions might have caused her? He wasn't sure, so he set the phone down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Hours passed and the evening grew darker. JD finally decided to reach out to Sarah, sending her a simple text. "Thank you for what you did today. I owe you more than I can say." He hit send and waited, unsure if she would reply. To his surprise, her response came almost immediately. "You don't owe me anything. Just keep doing right by the people who matter." Her words lingered. In his mind, simple yet profound. They reminded him of why he had started down this road in the first place, to help people, to make a difference, even if it meant making sacrifices along the way. Determined to turn the day's lessons into action, JD spent the next few hours drafting an email to his team. It was short but heartfelt, acknowledging the mistakes he had made and outlining steps he planned to take to ensure they wouldn't happen again. He promised transparency, accountability, and a renewed commitment to supporting those who depended on him. When he finished writing, he hesitated for a moment before hitting send. It was a small step, but it felt significant, a promise to himself and to others that change was possible. The following morning, JD woke early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. He dressed quickly and headed to a local community center where he had volunteered sporadically in the past. Today, however, he wasn't there to check a box or fulfill a requirement. He wanted to listen, to understand the struggles people faced, and find ways to help. As he walked through the doors, he was greeted by familiar faces, people who had once relied on his support, and others who were meeting him for the first time. One woman approached him, her hands clasped tightly around a cup of coffee. "Mr. Vance," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I heard about what happened yesterday. Are you okay?" JD smiled faintly, touched by her concern. "I'm fine," he replied honestly. "But I want to do better. For you, for everyone here. That's why I'm here today." The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and thanked him before walking away. Throughout the day, JD listened intently to stories of hardship, resilience, and hope. Each conversation reinforced the lessons he had learned in the courtroom, that success wasn't measured by wealth or power, but by the positive impact you had on others' lives. By the time he left the community center that evening, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, JD Vance felt ready to face it head-on. That night, as he sat alone in his study, JD reflected on the whirlwind of emotions he had experienced over the past 24 hours. From the tense courtroom showdown to the unexpected kindness of strangers, every moment had pushed him closer to understanding who he truly was and who he wanted to become. He pulled out a notebook and began jotting down ideas, plans, and reminders. At the top of the page, he wrote 3 words: Do better. It was a mantra, a promise, and a challenge all rolled into one. And as he closed the notebook and turned off the light, JD knew that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to live up to those words. The next morning, JD Vance woke up earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow through the curtains of his bedroom. He lay in bed for a few moments, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the past 2 days in his mind. It felt like he had lived an entire lifetime in that short span, moments of fear, anger, gratitude, and hope colliding into one overwhelming experience. As he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up, he made a silent promise to himself. Today would be different. After showering and dressing in simple, practical clothes, a far cry from the suits he usually wore, he grabbed a notebook and a pen before heading downstairs. In the kitchen, he brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the table, flipping open the notebook to a blank page. For the first time in years, JD allowed himself to think deeply about what truly mattered to him. Not money, not fame, not even the legacy he had once been so obsessed with building. What mattered most were the people whose lives he touched, the employees who depended on him, the families struggling to make ends meet, the communities fighting to stay afloat despite all odds. He scribbled down ideas as they came to him, some vague and others more concrete. Community outreach programs, scholarships for underprivileged students, partnerships with local businesses to create jobs. Each idea felt like a small step toward making things right, but together, they formed a vision that excited him in a way nothing else had in years. By the time he finished writing, the pages were filled with notes, arrows connecting thoughts, and reminders to follow up on specific actions. Satisfied, he closed the notebook and took another sip of coffee, feeling a spark of determination ignite within him. Later that day, JD visited one of his companies, a manufacturing plant located on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a glamorous place, but it was important. Dozens of workers bustled around, operating machines, packing products, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. When JD walked in, several heads turned, and whispers rippled through the room. Word of his courtroom appearance had spread quickly, and many employees weren't sure what to expect from him now. Would he act differently? Apologize? Or would he revert to his old ways? JD didn't waste time wondering how they saw him. Instead, he called everyone together for a brief meeting. Standing on a makeshift platform near the center of the factory floor, he looked out at the sea of faces watching him intently. Some looked curious, others skeptical, and a few seemed indifferent. "I know you've heard about what happened recently," he began, his voice clear and steady. "And I want to be honest with you, I messed up. I made decisions that hurt people, including some of you. That's something I can't take back, but it's also something I won't ignore." The room grew quieter, the hum of machinery fading into the background as everyone focused on his words. JD continued, his tone sincere. "I'm here because I want to do better, not just for me, but for all of you. You work hard every single day and you deserve someone who will fight for you, support you, and listen when you have concerns." He paused, letting his words sink in before adding, "So, starting today, I'm going to make changes. Real changes. And I need your help to figure out how we can build something stronger together." When he finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. Then, slowly, applause broke out. It started with just a few claps, hesitant and scattered, but soon grew louder as more people joined in. JD felt a lump rise in his throat, surprised by the warmth of their response. Afterward, several workers approached him, sharing their thoughts and offering suggestions. One man, older with graying hair and calloused hands, stepped forward and shook JD's hand firmly. "We appreciate this, Mr. Vance," he said simply. "Just don't forget us, all right?" JD nodded, promising he wouldn't. Over the next few weeks, JD threw himself into implementing the changes he had promised. He held regular meetings with employees, not just at the manufacturing plant but across all his businesses, encouraging open dialogue and actively seeking feedback. He introduced new policies aimed at improving working conditions, increasing wages, and providing better benefits. He also launched a mentorship program, pairing experienced workers with newcomers to ensure everyone had the tools they needed to succeed. These efforts didn't go unnoticed. Morale improved, productivity increased, and the atmosphere in the Yahoo workplace shifted noticeably. But JD knew that changing his approach in business was only part of the equation. He wanted to expand his impact beyond his own companies, reaching into the wider community. With Sarah Miller's words still echoing in his mind, "Just keep doing right by the people who matter," he reached out to local leaders and organizations to discuss potential collaborations. Together, they brainstormed initiatives aimed at addressing systemic issues like unemployment, lack of affordable housing, and access to education. JD offered funding, resources, and his time, determined to play an active role in creating lasting change. One project that particularly excited him was a job training program designed for individuals who had struggled to find employment due to gaps in their resumes or other barriers. Partnering with a nonprofit organization, JD helped set up workshops where participants could learn valuable skills while gaining real-world experience. On the day of the program's launch, JD attended the opening ceremony, mingling with attendees and listening to their stories. Many expressed gratitude for the opportunity, sharing how much it meant to them to have a second chance. As the weeks turned into months, JD found himself growing more comfortable in his new role. He no longer craved the spotlight or sought validation from others. Instead, he derived satisfaction from seeing the tangible results of his efforts, the smiles on workers' faces, the success stories emerging from the training program, the positive feedback from community members. It wasn't always easy. There were setbacks and challenges along the way, moments when doubt crept in and he questioned whether he was doing enough. But each time, he reminded himself of the lessons he had learned in the courtroom, that growth came from accountability, and real change required patience and persistence. One evening, as JD sat in his study reviewing progress reports and planning future projects, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Sarah Miller. "Just wanted to say I'm proud of the work you're doing. Keep going." Her message brought a smile to his face, and he replied immediately, "Thank you again for everything. None of this would have been possible without you." Their exchange reminded JD of how interconnected life truly was. Every action, no matter how small, had ripple effects that could shape the world in unexpected ways. Sarah's courage in speaking up during the trial had changed the course of his life, and indirectly, the lives of countless others. Reflecting on this, JD realized that true leadership wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about listening, learning, and using whatever influence you had to lift others up. With renewed energy, JD returned to his work, pouring his heart into projects that aligned with his values. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would undoubtedly be more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long while, he felt grounded, purposeful, and hopeful. The courtroom experience had stripped away the layers of pride and ego he had carried for so long, revealing a version of himself that was more authentic and compassionate. And as he looked toward the future, JD Vance understood that the greatest victories weren't measured by personal achievements but by the lives he touched along the way. Months had passed since JD Vance's courtroom ordeal, and the changes he had promised to make were beginning to take shape. The transformation wasn't just visible in his businesses or the community programs he supported. It was evident in him as a person. He carried himself differently now, with less arrogance and more humility. His focus had shifted from proving himself to others to simply doing what he believed was right. It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were days when doubts crept in and setbacks tested his resolve, but each challenge only strengthened his determination to stay on this new path. One crisp autumn afternoon, JD found himself standing in front of a group of high school students at a local career fair. The event was organized by one of the nonprofits he had partnered with, aimed at inspiring young people to pursue opportunities they might not have considered otherwise. As he looked out at the sea of curious faces, JD felt a mix of nerves and excitement. Public speaking had never been an issue for him, but this was different. These weren't reporters hanging on his every word or employees expecting him to lead. They were kids full of potential and dreams looking for guidance. He started by sharing his own story, keeping it simple and relatable. "I grew up in a small town," he began, his voice warm and steady. "My family didn't have much and life wasn't always easy, but I learned early on that hard work and asking for help when you need it can take you far." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I've made plenty of mistakes along the way, some big ones, but I've also learned that it's never too late to change direction. If I can do it, so can you." The students listened intently, their eyes wide with interest. When JD finished speaking, a wave of questions followed. "How do you know what job is right for you?" one student asked. Another chimed in. "What if you fail? How do you keep going?" JD answered honestly, drawing from his own experiences. He admitted that failure was scary, but emphasized that it was also part of growth. "You won't get everything right the first time," he said with a smile, "but every step teaches you something valuable. Just don't give up." As the session wrapped up, several students approached JD to thank him. One girl, shy but determined, handed him a note before hurrying away. Curious, JD unfolded it later and read the brief message inside. "Thank you for reminding me that my past doesn't define me. I want to be brave like you." Her words struck a chord deep within him, filling him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Back at his office, JD spent hours reviewing reports and planning new initiatives. The job training program he had helped launch was thriving, with dozens of participants already securing stable employment. Inspired by its success, he decided to expand it, reaching out to neighboring towns to bring similar opportunities to even more people. He also worked closely with local schools to create internships and mentorship opportunities, ensuring students had a clear path forward after graduation. But JD's efforts weren't limited to professional development. He recognized that many of the challenges people faced stemmed from deeper systemic issues such as poverty, lack of affordable housing, and limited access to healthcare. Determined to address these problems, he collaborated with community leaders to establish a fund aimed at supporting struggling families. The initiative provided financial assistance for rent, groceries, and medical bills, offering a lifeline to those who needed it most. One evening, while attending a fundraising dinner for the program, JD ran into Sarah Miller. They hadn't seen each other since the day she had spoken up in court, and her presence caught him off guard. She looked different somehow, more confident perhaps, and her smile lit up the room as she greeted him warmly. "It's good to see you," she said, extending her hand. JD shook it firmly, feeling a rush of gratitude. "It's good to see you too," he replied sincerely. "I wouldn't be here without you." They sat together during the event, chatting about everything from their shared projects to personal updates. Sarah mentioned she had recently started volunteering with a literacy program, helping adults improve their reading skills. JD listened intently, impressed by her dedication. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said, half joking but completely serious. Sarah laughed softly, brushing off the compliment. "We're all just trying to do our part," she replied, modestly. Their conversation turned to the future, and JD shared his plans to continue expanding his efforts. "There's still so much to do," he admitted, his tone thoughtful. "But I think we're making progress. Slowly, but surely." Sarah nodded in agreement, her expression encouraging. "Just remember why you started," she said gently. "That's what will keep you going when things get tough." Her advice stayed with JD long after the event ended. Over the following weeks, he leaned on it whenever doubt threatened to creep in. There were moments when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, when the scale of the problems he was tackling seemed insurmountable, but Sarah's reminder gave him clarity. It wasn't about solving everything at once. It was about taking one step at a time, staying true to his values, and trusting that even small actions could create meaningful change. In December, JD organized a holiday gathering for employees and their families at one of his facilities. The event was meant to celebrate their hard work throughout the year and foster a sense of community. Tables were set up with food, music played softly in the background, and children ran around laughing, their joy infectious. JD mingled with attendees, shaking hands, sharing stories, and thanking everyone for their contributions. At one point, he stood near the stage watching the scene unfold before him. A young boy tugged at his sleeve, holding out a handmade card. "This is for you," the child said shyly, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. JD knelt down to accept it, smiling warmly. "Thank you," he said, opening the card to reveal a colorful drawing of stick figures holding hands under a bright sun. Inside, written in uneven letters, was a simple message: "Thanks for helping us." Tears welled up in JD's eyes as he hugged the boy tightly. In that moment, he realized how far he had come, not just professionally but personally. The man who had once walked into a courtroom brimming with defiance was now someone who valued connection, empathy, and service above all else. It wasn't about titles or achievements anymore. It was about being present, showing up for others, and using his resources to make a difference. As the year drew to a close, JD took time to reflect on everything that had happened. He thought about the courtroom hearing that had forced him to confront his flaws, the unexpected ally who had stepped forward to defend him, and the countless individuals whose lives intersected with his own. Each experience had shaped him in ways he couldn't have predicted, teaching him lessons he would carry for the rest of his life. On New Year's Eve, JD sat alone in his study, a cup of coffee in hand and a notebook open on the desk. He flipped through the pages, reading over notes he had jotted down over the past months, ideas, goals, reminders, and reflections. At the top of the last page, he wrote 2 words: "Keep going." It was a promise to himself, a reminder that the journey wasn't over yet. There would be more challenges ahead, more lessons to learn, and more lives to touch. But for the first time in a long while, JD Vance felt ready to face whatever came next, with humility, hope, and an unwavering commitment to doing better. The new year brought with it a fresh start, and JD Vance wasted no time diving into his plans. January mornings were cold, but JD woke up early each day, eager to tackle the tasks ahead. He had spent the holidays reflecting on the progress he'd made and mapping out what still needed to be done. His notebook was filled with ideas, some big, some small, but all aimed at creating lasting change. Every morning he flipped through its pages, reminding himself of the promises he had made not just to others, but to himself. One of his first priorities was expanding the job training program that had proven so successful. With help from community, leaders, and local businesses, JD worked tirelessly to bring the initiative to nearby towns. The goal was simple: provide people with skills they could use to build better lives for themselves and their families. But behind that simplicity lay countless hours of planning, meetings, and coordination. JD didn't mind the work. In fact, he found joy in it. Seeing the smiles on participants' faces when they landed their first job or completed a course reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. As the weeks went by, JD began receiving invitations to speak at events, community forums, school assemblies, even conferences focused on social responsibility. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't new to him, but these audiences weren't like the ones he used to address. They weren't there to hear polished speeches or political rhetoric. They wanted honesty, vulnerability, and real stories. So, JD prepared carefully, focusing on sharing lessons he had learned rather than trying to impress anyone. At one such event held in a packed auditorium, JD stood on stage under bright lights, gripping the podium with both hands. "I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers," he began, his voice steady but warm. "In fact, I've spent most of my life learning how little I actually know." The crowd chuckled softly, easing the tension in the room. JD continued, recounting moments from his courtroom experience and the humbling realization that followed. He talked about Sarah Miller's courage, the judge's stern warning, and the weight of accountability. By the end of his speech, the audience erupted into applause, not because he had dazzled them with words, but because he had connected with them through authenticity. Afterward, people lined up to speak with him, shaking his hand and thanking him for his message. A young woman approached him last, her eyes shining with emotion. "What you said tonight really hit home for me," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been stuck in a job I hate because I didn't think I could do anything else. Hearing your story gives me hope." JD smiled warmly, offering words of encouragement. "You're stronger than you think," he told her. "Take it one step at a time." Back home, JD threw himself into another project close to his heart: affordable housing. For months, he had been working with architects, city officials, and non-profit organizations to design a housing development specifically for low-income families. It wasn't easy. There were budget constraints, zoning laws, and endless bureaucratic hurdles, but JD refused to give up. He visited construction sites regularly, checking on progress and talking to workers. He also met with future residents, listening to their concerns and incorporating their feedback into the plans. By spring, the first phase of the project was complete. Rows of modest yet cozy homes stood side by side, painted in cheerful colors, and surrounded by green spaces. On move-in day, JD joined families as they unpacked boxes and decorated their new living rooms. Children ran around playing tag while parents exchanged hugs and tears of gratitude. One father, holding his toddler in his arms, turned to JD and said simply, "Thank you for believing in us." Those 5 words struck JD deeply, reinforcing his belief that every effort mattered, no matter how small it seemed. Despite his successes, JD knew there was still much to be done. Systemic issues like poverty and inequality couldn't be solved overnight, and he often felt overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the challenges. Late at night, after long days of meetings and site visits, he would sit alone in his study, staring at the walls and wondering if he was doing enough. Doubts crept in, whispering that maybe he should focus on something simpler, something less demanding. But then he'd remember Sarah's advice: just keep doing right by the people who matter. And with that thought, he'd push forward, determined to stay the course. Summer arrived, bringing warmth and longer days. JD decided to host a picnic for employees and their families at a nearby park. It was meant to be a casual gathering, a chance for everyone to relax and enjoy each other's company without the pressures of work looming over them. Tables were set up under shady trees, laden with food and drinks. Kids played games, laughter echoed through the air, and conversations flowed freely. JD wandered among the groups, stopping to chat and listen to stories. At one table, he found himself seated next to an older employee named Margaret. She had been with one of his companies for decades, quietly working behind the scenes and rarely drawing attention to herself. As they talked, JD learned about her struggles raising 2 children on her own and how she had almost quit during tough times. "But then you stepped in," she said, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "You helped me keep going when I didn't think I could." JD was taken aback. He hadn't realized the impact of his actions, or perhaps he had forgotten. Margaret's words reminded him that kindness, no matter how small, could leave a lasting impression. Toward the end of the picnic, JD climbed onto a small platform to say a few words. Holding a microphone, he looked out at the smiling faces before him. "This isn't just a company," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's a family. We've been through ups and downs together, and I'm proud of everything we've accomplished. Thank you for trusting me, for sticking with me, and for showing me what true resilience looks like." As autumn approached, JD reflected on the year that had passed. So much had changed, not just in his life, but in the lives of those around him. He thought about the courtroom hearing that had forced him to confront his flaws, the unexpected ally who had spoken up for him, and the countless individuals whose stories had inspired him along the way. Each moment had taught him something valuable, shaping him into someone he barely recognized compared to the man he used to be. On a cool October evening, JD sat on his porch, sipping coffee and watching the sun dip below the horizon. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. It was a text from Sarah Miller. "Thinking about you tonight. Keep being the person you are now." JD smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. Without her courage and honesty, none of this would have been possible. He replied quickly, "Couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for everything." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, JD leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet surround him. He thought about the road ahead, knowing it wouldn't always be smooth. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But he also knew that he had found his purpose, not in titles or achievements, but in serving others and making a difference, however small. With a deep sense of peace, JD whispered to himself, almost as if sealing a promise, "Keep going.